Hello and welcome back to Logan Sounds Off. Today I'm going to be speaking to a really interesting man behind a lot of interesting movies, including The Little Mermaid 2, a TV program Fabulous, some of you guys might know, as well as one of his latest projects, Changing Light by the Ironsides. He's an incredible guy and I'm really excited to speak to Lou King. Hey Lou, how are you?
I'm doing very well, Logan. I hope you are too. First off, thank you very much for having me. Very excited to be here.
Thanks so much. And the pleasure is all mine to have you here on my podcast. I'm really excited to have a chat. And for those who don't know you, could you please tell us a little bit about yourself?
Let's see. Well, I'm a composer based in New York City. Over my career, I've had many different chapters doing many different things. Early on, I wrote a lot of music for television commercials. At that same time, I was also orchestrating and arranging for television commercials. Then a little bit on the side, I would be orchestrating for films. Did some Disney work, some ABC work. And then as the years went by, I wanted to do something a little more creatively satisfying, and turned my focus into film as a composer. And I've worked on quite a few independent short films in the past 6 years. I've also, at that same time, been doing work as a backing arranger for musical artists, and also became part of the Ironsides. So that's kind of the arc in a quick bit.
That's brilliant. And there truly is a lot, guys. And I'm really excited to speak about all of this in the interview. But just starting off way, way back at the start, when you were in and around just before you turn into a teenager, I listened to an interview where you said that your family didn't play really any instruments. They did listen to a bit of music, but just the normal kind of amount for family, and that uh your your journey with playing music began with the school band in eighth or ninth grade. But before that, yourself, maybe through friends or maybe through relatives, did you have any musical interests?
Um, I'm not sure that music played a huge part in my life before I actually picked up an instrument and started really being immersed in it. I wasn't a huge music fan at a very young age. But once I started playing it, then it became something very important to me, where I was, buying music and listening to music and playing in wedding bands as a teenager, and being in every musical outlet I could be that came through the school. It really took that personal involvement in performing music that really was the spark. Before that, not that I didn't listen to it, but I don't think it was that important to me at the time.
I see. And then when you really started to get into music and started playing, I know you started off with saxophone, I believe,
Yes.
and you went on to play many other instruments, I believe the bass and trombone as well.
Yes.
Um, what kind of music did you listen to when you started to get into it?
A very eclectic mix, because you would be influenced by the music that you were playing at school. So in a concert band setting, it would be, Ralph Vaughan Williams and Claire Grundman arrangements of American folk tunes, and Holst's has some beautiful band music. So you'd have that side, and then on the other side, you'd be interested in whatever pop music was going on. And I was also interested in. I was a huge Rush fan as a kid. Uh, uh,
Brilliant
I
band.
I still have a Rickenbacker black bass because of my fandom for Geddy Lee. Uh, but it was pretty wide. Some jazz. I wasn't as heavily into jazz as a teenager because I grew up in a fairly rural area where really legit jazz wasn't part of something that you would get exposed to unless you were really looking for it. So, Coltrane and Miles and
Oh wow.
Bird, and really that came very late in my teenage years, right into college was where I really got my full dose of legitimate jazz.
Oh, I see. And then as well, you mentioned there that you played in some wedding bands. So
Yep.
going from a school band to playing like live at weddings, it's a big jump. How did that start? Just playing live for different weddings and things.
Friends get a band together. I think I had friends who were in a band that were had been doing weddings, and there was probably an opening, and they decided to bring me in, and that was kind of how I got my foot in the door. Probably a little bit of saxophone work, but probably bass ended up being more often than not.
Oh, okay. Well, and then as well as this, um, it's interesting to see how musically diverse you were, and even that eclectic mix from Miles in your later years to Rush as a teenager. It's pretty cool. But I know that you said from a young age, even though you hadn't explored all the music you were going to yet, that you knew you wanted to be involved with music.
Yes.
Now, what was the reason behind you wanting to be involved with music? What is it about playing music or listening to music that you love?
Well, I think it was both. I think it was a bit of a practical decision, which sounds weird, in the fact of I obviously had some degree of talent, and I knew that if it was something that I enjoyed doing and had a talent for, I would do the work that was necessary to grow and get better. I do think, whether I realized it at the time or not, there is something about the connection between you and someone else that music has. And I mean, on every level, everything from whether you're performing it for an audience, recording it for an audience, or even what you're doing with a podcast. It's like talking about music, having a community about music, having the fandom about something, talking about music. It was all of that put together that I think kind of pushed me in that direction, and it seemed the most exciting of a career path.
It is pretty exciting, and I completely agree with even just for me, I love doing the podcast and I love interviewing people like you just to speak about music. So that's really, really cool. So that's a great answer. Thank you for that. And after your teenage years where you're playing in wedding bands in your school band and getting into all these really cool different people, then you went into college and you actually attended Berkeley, which is
Yes.
really, really cool. So jumping from high school to Berkeley, you definitely have a lot of way more different people who can introduce you to way more different music. And just you're learning a lot more about music, which is super cool. Um, so what was that like for you making that transition and discovering all this new information and new music?
That was amazing. I for a few reasons. You you're a teenager and you think, oh, I'm a pretty good saxophone player. I'll be a professional saxophonist. You walk in and you meet people who are amazingly talented, amazingly gifted, and you've got that coming at you, and then just the exposure, as you said, to new music I hadn't heard before, to begin with, just that. So there's the constant sharing of new music. You're getting all these influences and exposed to stuff that I was never exposed to, especially, as I said, given my background of being in a fairly small town where not a lot penetrated culturally. um and then from an educational standpoint, I had something of a music theory uh, education in high school, and a little bit of a orchestration, arranging, composition background in exposure in high school, but nothing like what I got in college. And that is what I really gravitated towards. I realized very quickly that I did not have the talent or really the discipline to play and become what I would need to become as a saxophonist to make it as a professional. But I loved everything about looking at scores, looking at music theory, how to compose music, how to think about music. Everything about that excited me, and I got a lot of encouragement and quickly kind of turned my attention to doing that. But I've said it many times, without having gone to college, I would not have a career. I learned there are things I'll do something this week that the germ of whatever it is I learned when I was in college, or I'll remember something that I was told by a professor in college. It happens all the time. That's where I really got my musical foundation.
Wow, that's actually really interesting. And I think for any upcoming musicians, maybe are looking to go to college or university to start learning music, that's that's a great tip for them. So thank you for that. But it does sound very exciting learning about all this new music. And from Berkeley, you did learn a lot and it paid off because you've written scores for some really interesting things, including The Little Mermaid 2, Fabulous, the TV program. And much, much more. And even we were saying that you worked with ABC and Disney and things like that. Um, so looking back to just after coming out of Berkeley, what was it like starting your career in the beginning?
So when I got out of college, I moved with friends to New York City. It took a it it I got very lucky actually. It was maybe 3 or 4 months after I moved here that I got a very level job at a music production company that mostly did music for advertising. So that got my foot in the door. I was able to get an environment of a recording studio and staff composers and seeing how that all worked because I really didn't have much of an understanding of how a place like that would work. But I was doing really menial jobs. It was errands and cleaning and straightening up and putting up a microphone, putting down a microphone, that kind of stuff. But then it didn't take very long before um, I started arranging and orchestrating for the composers that were on staff. They had a very talented staff, but no one was really legitimately trained in that world. So if they did something for an orchestra, someone would write a very crude sketch on a computer, but then they would bring in an outside orchestrator, arranger to actually create what it would be and write out everything for an actual orchestra. So it wasn't long after I was there that I started doing that on everything, which was fantastic because then maybe once a week, sometimes more, I was conducting and arranging for a recording session full of A-list New York City session musicians. So
Wow.
it was a really wonderful way to hone your craft and really uh, take all the things that I had learned and on paper and actually use them practically. Um, and it was in that same time where I had the opportunity to be an orchestrator on some larger projects. Little Mermaid 2, I didn't compose the score, but I was an orchestrator on.
Oh, sorry.
No, not at all, not at all. And those other projects at that time were my role was as an orchestrator. I did the opening credits for the opening titles for Columbia Pictures as an orchestrator and a conductor. So it was amazing to get thrown into that and to be able to have that experience because there's really nothing like an actual orchestra playing anything that you've had any part of, even just as an orchestrator. It's truly phenomenal.
And I can totally get that, especially for me. I love listening to classical music, and especially that sound is incredible with an orchestra. So to have even your part being a big part of it, it would be incredible. And for me, who's never been involved in anything like that, and I don't see myself ever doing what you do. I honestly, I'm not musically minded that way for doing anything like that. But it does sound really, really just a difficult thing to do. So what kind of preparation would you go through to maybe writing a score or maybe being an orchestrator or an arranger?
Well, I think the foundation, it's really the foundation that I got in college. So really really what it is having the knowledge of an orchestra. If you think of if you're an instrumentalist, you have a great knowledge of your instrument. You have a great command of your instrument. So you can play all kinds of things. You can you're very facile at the instrument. Uh Basically the parallel to that would be as a writer, you understand how an orchestra works. You understand how all the different instruments sound. You know how in different registers, meaning if you're talking about a trumpet, really low notes on a trumpet versus really high notes on the trumpet. What's the difference? Even though it's coming out of the same instrument, there is a different character as you go through the range of any instrument. You need to know that. You need to know how that blends and or doesn't blend with other instruments. And really what it is it's a lot like being a painter. You know how colors work when you combine them. You know how colors work next to each other. You know uh what emotions can come when you're using certain instruments. And that's kind of the foundation of orchestration, that you're trying to, and then, kind of you're taking an emotion of music and applying the instruments that resonate and support and convey what you're trying to tell a listener.
Wow, it actually it's a really intricate process, but very interesting. And that's why great people like you, Lou, bring orchestras together. So thank you for that. And you've worked on many pieces regarding this for TV, as we were mentioning earlier, and film. You've also worked with Xbox, Google, and many more. Um, so when you're doing these for different things, because TV is different from film, and obviously doing things for Xbox and Google is completely different. But
Yes.
would your technique vary while working with these, vary from maybe TV to film?
I think the biggest difference is what the goal is and what the medium is asking for. So when I'm composing for ads, like something for Xbox or Nintendo, number one, we have a very compressed amount of time. So we're telling a story in 30 seconds, 60 seconds, or 90 seconds. And it tends to be uh we're saying a lot in a short amount of time. We're trying to tell a story quickly, and there's subtlety is not high on the list because we don't have time for subtlety. You're trying to get something across quickly. So it tends to be very clear, bold statements. If whatever the emotion is, if the emotion is energy, we really want energy. If everything's big, we really want it big. And we really want to pull the audience in that way. Film or even series offers us time in a way that an ad doesn't. So we now have room for subtlety. We now have room for development of ideas. There's all kinds of things you can do where you're introducing something early on in a film that you will then manipulate or enhance or change up as the story moves, as it evolves, as the story moves. So I'd say the biggest challenge as a composer when you're going from something like an ad is you have to remember to let the music breathe. That now when we're talking about, because you're going from telling an entire story, we'll say in 90 seconds, to now telling a very small part of a story in maybe 2 minutes. So the music gets to sit and doesn't have to work so hard. And you're given the ability to let what's on the screen kind of carry the heavy load, and the music's a bit more supportive and maybe doesn't have to do as much as it might in an ad.
Wow, that's actually a really good way to put it. I never really thought about it that way. And I actually discovered this like a couple of years ago, where when I was about 7 or 8, I was watching a film, and at this one part, the soundtrack just stopped, and the movie continued for a couple of minutes, and then the music came back in. But I realized during that time, the movie actually felt quite empty, and I had a completely different feel about it. And that was kind of the first time where I realized there is such a big importance of soundtracks towards films. So it's interesting to see that. And you convey these emotions very well. And it's not just me who thinks that. You've actually won a ton of awards, including the Accolade Global Film Competition Award of Merit, the British Web Award for Best Music in Fabulous, and many more. I haven't got them listed down in front of me, I'm
That's
sorry.
okay.
But What was it like getting these awards? Because it's gotta it's gotta make a big impact on yourself.
Oh, it's always nice to have the work recognized. It's always very flattering. I mean, really the goal you're going into doing this is that you're hoping that the people who brought you in are happy. So when my director is happy and when they have great things to say about working with you and what you did, that's really the most important thing. Having a, film festival recognize it is really just icing on the cake. It's just it's nice to see, and it's really nice to see when anything I've worked on garners recognition like that, whether it's my score or the film itself. uh it 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 it's just satisfying to see people appreciate the work.
Well, that's a lovely thing to say. And actually, we're going to talk about people really appreciating your work in a couple of minutes on your work with Changing Light, which some of you might know this as it's by a really cool group called the Ironsides, which Lou is now involved in, and he worked on the project Changing Light. And first off, I just want to say, as a personal note, that album I love. I'm looking for a pressing of it somewhere, a vinyl pressing that I can get it just to listen to, because I recently got a new record player because I used to have this little dinky one that was like in a
Hmm.
suitcase. So now I've
Yes.
got a proper full on setup that, like, listening to Pink Floyd and stuff is very surreal now. So I can't wait to hear, because going from listening to Changing Light on your phone to going to it on a proper system, I can't wait for that. So I'm excited for that experience. But I'd want to ask, because it's very interesting, and the group's been playing for a little while now. I believe it was formed around 2010. Um, how did your journey begin with the Ironsides?
So I got a call in October of 2020 from a man named Max Ramey. And Max is the bass player and the leader of the Ironsides. And Max and I had worked together somewhat unknowingly. Uh, there was a group called The Sentiments that did a release in, I want to say 2018, two singles, and Max played bass, and I did some string arranging on it. And Max with the Ironsides always wanted to create this melding of orchestra and soul and all these different influences, but never really had the right people to make it happen. And a mutual friend of ours said, "You really should call Lou. He's the perfect guy for this. I think it would be great." So basically Max said, what we want to do is we would co-write the music together, and then I would arrange, orchestrate the orchestra, and we would go from there. I was certainly interested, and at the time, so we're not deep into the pandemic, but things are a little on the slower side, and it's creatively sounded something really interesting. So I thought, well, we'll give it a try. Now, keep in mind that I'm located in New York City, and the band is located outside around the San Francisco Bay Area, 3,000 miles away. So first we had to figure out exactly how we're going to co-write, because it's not going to be like Lennon and McCartney sitting next to each other on a piano. So that was the first challenge. But basically the way we worked it out was they were coming up with the foundations of the songs. So you would have, chord changes, grooves, tempo, all that was being created by them. Sometimes I would get basic, sometimes I would get it in a demo phase, where maybe we'd have a little bit of a back and forth of some comments. But for the most part, I was getting kind of, this is kind of what we're going to build on top of. And then I would take those, we would have a conversation of, well, what do we want to do with that? Where do we want to take it? What are the adjectives that are describing the emotions that we want the listener to get? What's the feel of what this is? And then I would, using samples, create a mock-up of what it would be like when we actually recorded it with an orchestra. And I would do a version, send that off. They'd listen. We'd have a little conversation. We like this. We like that. This sounds great. Could the melody be a little simpler? Maybe we don't need this little thing here. and I would make some revisions, and we'd have a little bit of a back and forth, and then we'd settle on what the song was going to be. And we hit it off right off the bat. There was very little, uh, there wasn't any huge back and forth, meaning like whatever they would send me, I would take it in a direction, and it was pretty much what we were all looking for. We were definitely on the same page uh, all the time. The changes we were making were really just small things. And we just got all those sketched up, and then after that became the actual recording of the orchestra. And the way we approached the recording of the orchestra was kind of in a piecemeal way, as opposed to having everyone in a room recording everyone at the same time. We kind of stuck to a little bit of a technique that would have been done in the 70s, where we had a small violin section and then you would layer them. We did this for a couple of reasons. From a budget, we couldn't really get a huge room. And what we also liked was that we'd have a lot more control by doing it this way. And from a production standpoint, it kind of echoed what was done in the early 70s quite a bit,
Yeah.
because multi-track was new, and everyone was excited by the fact that, well, we could just have a few and, layer them, and we'd have, everything that comes with that. So that's how the album kind of got put together. Again, I being in New York City, the recording sessions being outside of San Francisco, they would put a laptop in front of the group, and I would sit much like this, and I would talk to the players, and we'd run through things and kind of do the recording sessions that way, which worked out shockingly well.
And actually, you can definitely hear that harmony. And I heard you in an interview speaking about the layering, and I thought that was really cool. And just sticking to that authenticity, where for me, when I first heard the album, I was going, it sounds really like something, but I just can't really. I don't know what it is, but that 70s sound and that 60s sound, it's really cool that you had the layering in there. It's really, really cool. And what so recording something in person is very different to recording it remotely through a computer. So for you, were there many differences, or was there no difference at all? Was it just as simple as being in person?
I think I think the only thing we really lost by my not being in a room to having a conversation of guiding the musicians. When you write things on paper, and this is what they're going to play, and there's still there's still some interpretation, and there's also still some rehearsing that needs to happen. And it's a little bit easier to do that when you're in the same room as the players. You can pick up on some nuance and some small things that you're going to hear that I may not necessarily hear when I'm kind of not in the room. Microphone maybe doesn't quite, the mic that we were using so I could hear them, I wouldn't necessarily pick up on it. I would say really those things are the biggest, and it also takes a little bit longer. The whole process is a little slower, whereas me being in the room, it's a little easier to communicate. I'd say those are really the biggest changes, or the biggest differences. But from an end product standpoint, it's a very nuanced difference if I had been in the same room with them.
It's actually really cool because although you had this really different recording process, and as well, you were 3,000 miles away, you were still able to make that connection on the album. And again, it's not just me saying this, because the vinyl copy of the Ironsides, because I believe there was a couple of pressings, like there was a caramel swirl one, a blue swirl copy, and a black vinyl. They sold out in 2 weeks. Like,
Yes.
that
Yes.
was crazy. How did you react to that when you were told the Ironsides, the album sold out already?
Well, that was kind of amazing. For the Really, because we had no expectations when we created it, meaning we're creating an album of instrumentals that is inspired by music from 50 and 55 years ago. Um, and we had no idea if anyone would be interested, if anyone would buy it, what kind of a audience there really was for it. We really didn't know. So to be able to release it and have that kind of a response was truly amazing, really flattering. And I also have to hand it to our label, Coal Mine, and Terry Cole, because they did a wonderful job of letting people know it was coming, trying to create some buzz. And I don't think that, obviously, that wouldn't have happened without them being behind the record, but it was truly amazing to have that happen.
And yeah, a big shout out to Coal Mine because anyone who's familiar with Coal Mine Records does love a lot of their records and speaks a lot about them. And a big shout out, I was telling you before the interview, Lou, a big shout out to Gary Kyo, owner of Roller Coaster Records in Kilkenny, Ireland. He played the Ironsides album, Changing Light, I think every day for 3 months in the shop on his record player, and he buys every Coal Mine release. So you can find it there on their website. It'll be linked below. And also Coal Mine Records' website as well will be linked below. Um, but it really is a really lovely album. And the album does have many tones. It's hard to put an exact genre on the album. It is quite difficult. So for you, even just working on the album, uh, how do you discover new sounds to influence your work with a lot of this music?
Well, I think part of the reason why the album kind of is hard to kind of give it a label is kind of because of the diversity of the group. It's everybody's coming in with their own point of view and their own backgrounds and their own influences, and everyone's kind of given the latitude to bring those in creating the bigger picture. um I really tried to not think too much and let the music take me where it wants to go. So, and I know that sounds very kind of artsy, but it's kind of true. I certainly listened to some things from the era before we even got started. Meaning, when they sent me the first tune, maybe it was even before they sent me the first tune, I was just kind of listening to some things from the era just to kind of get, all right, this is kind of the vibe, and this is kind of how the ensembles are, little things that maybe to refresh my memory. But it really, more often than not, was very instinctive. I would listen to the basics a bunch of times and kind of get that in my head, get the groove in my head, get the mood in my head, and then kind of let my brain go places. And it tends to start with melody. So I'm hearing the groove, and then I'm kind of hearing what the melody is kind of over that. Uh Return from Ashes. Uh I knew what the melody was, or where the melody was going, like halfway through listening to it. When like the third time the verse comes up, it's like I was already humming what the melody should be. Sometimes you can just, it just comes to you, and then you kind of take what comes to you and then you kind of work it. So now it's, all right, I like where it's starting, but where's it going to go? It needs to go somewhere. It's too repetitive. How am I going to change it? Where's it? And that's really what the process looks like. And then once you have that, then you start filling it in. And it's like, then it becomes the orchestration and arranging part. So strings are on the melody. When does the brass come in? Does the brass come in? What instruments are behind it? How big is it? How small? How much of a grow is there in the ensemble? And it really is kind of instinctive, and then becomes a bit more logical, if that makes sense.
Yeah, that it's really cool actually, and it shows why you're such a good composer, even just an orchestrator and arranger, by just seeing where the melody is going. Um, and I can tell that's a really interesting and cool skill to have. So thank you for sharing that with us. Um, but now I'd just like to speak about regarding, just as my last couple of questions, You're obviously, as we've been speaking throughout the interview, you're a big music fan, but you're also a really, really clever musician. So first, I'd like to ask you, um, for any upcoming musicians, whether they be wanting to be a composer or an arranger, or maybe they want to do something completely different, what tip would you give them to nearly boost their progress as a musician?
Well, I think the great resource that everyone has now that I didn't have, what is the internet. There is so much knowledge out there. There is so much that you can learn on your own, so many things that you can be exposed to. Uh, so there's the first thing. You have to be curious and you have to want to learn. So figure out kind of what it is, that what arena that you're interested in, whatever it is, and then start to look. Certainly YouTube is a fantastic resource. There are so many people who are talking about orchestration, arranging, composing. There is no shortage of those resources. If you're a performer on your instrument, again, there are no shortage of great instrumentalists um, giving tips about how to get the command of your instrument. So I think there's that part. So you really have to love the process of getting better and growing as an artist and looking at those resources. And you can do all those without ever going to a college or higher learning. They're all out there, and you could. It's amazing what you can accomplish. And then I think the other part is you have to if you're a creator, you have to create as much as you can. Don't be afraid to fail. You're going to write things that you don't like. You're going to write things that are bad, especially early when you're starting out. You're going to write things and you're going to say, this is horrible. But you have to do that to get the experience to write the good stuff. And the fact that you know that it's bad is great. That means you have taste. So now we're just trying to hone our skills and do it more, that the good stuff comes out more than the bad stuff. I mean, I write things and don't necessarily like them when they first come out either, and then they get worked. But I think failure is part of the process, and you have to be okay with that. And then I think the third thing is you have to put yourself out there. And what I mean by that is people have to know you exist. So if you're a bass player and if that's what you want to do, and if no one knows you exist, you're not going to be playing with anybody if no one knows you exist. So meet as many people as you can and be part of the community. And that's where opportunity is going to come. And the same thing's true if you're a composer. If you want to be a composer for film, people have to know you exist, or they're never going to bring you in as a partner to score their films. But I'd say those are kind of the big bits of advice I would give.
That is some very, very good advice. So thank you so much for that, Lou. And I have a bit of a and I this is one of my favorite questions that I ask in a lot of my interviews towards the end. So this is where I have a lot of fun. Um just discussing music, as you were mentioning earlier, that just fandom element is really what I love about doing a podcast. This is a bit of a two-part question. First of all, I'd like to ask, as a composer and as an arranger and as an orchestrator, what people are you listening to at the moment, if you're listening to any, who are kind of influencing your work?
That's a tough one, because I haven't had too much time to kind of sit back and listen to things. There are some just old favorites that I'll pop on that still influence me. Certainly it's Stravinsky and Bartok. They're so deep, that there's so much there that I'll be long gone and not have been able to investigate everything there is to learn from those two composers. Uh, so there's certainly that. And I think every time I watch a film and hear a score, there's always a little something to be learned, picked up, an approach. So I think my answer, non-answer to your question is I'd like to think I try to take away things from everything I hear. Uh, I think that's kind of important to kind of be open and just hear things and try to learn from anything that you happen to be listening to.
That's really beautiful. Thank you so much for that answer. And now for a bit more of a fun question, which I love doing with a lot of my guests, is at the second part to our question is just maybe regarding albums or a new single that you might have heard or just anything. Do you have any recommendations that you'd like to share?
Oh boy. Let's see. Um, what do I have? Well, I'll go two prong. I will say if you're unfamiliar with a classical composer by the name of Lily Boulanger, you should check out Lily Boulanger. Uh, she's a phenomenal composer from early 1900s. Died at a very young age. Wrote some beautiful music. It's a small catalog. I think she was in her late 20s when she died. But seek her out. You can find her everywhere. That's a wonderful classical composer that people don't know. And then there's a great new album on Coal Mine from the Parlor Greens.
Their debut, isn't
Organ,
it?
yeah, the debut organ trio. What I've heard, I've loved. There's a great one.
I have that on my
Um,
Bandcamp wish list to have a listen
yes,
to. So yeah, I'm excited to have a listen to that. I'll definitely check that out.
that's a great lineup. Uh, Jimmy Scratch James on guitar. He's insane. He's just a wonderful guitarist. The new Aaron Fraser album that just came out is quite good. I've caught a couple of cuts off that I have it here, but I haven't had time to listen to it. That's a good one. Um, I'm afraid that's all I have.
Well, that's still a great amount of recommendations. So thank you for that. I hope you guys have a listen to a couple of those. So I hope you guys enjoy those recommendations. And Lou, that was my last question. So I've loved this conversation that I've had with you. I've loved speaking to you about your career. Like ever since I discovered the Ironsides, I've been in awe with not only them but your work as well. It's really, really cool. So I do want to thank you so much for joining me on my podcast, and just sharing your thoughts about all these different things to us. Yeah, it's really, really appreciated.
Well, thank you so much for having me. I'm flattered to be on the podcast. I think it's fantastic that you're doing this and sharing your love of music with the world. And I think that's really the greatest thing the internet brings us. We get to connect with the musical community out there.
Thank you so much, Lou. That's a brilliant way to end the podcast. Thanks so much.
Thank you. Be well.
Have a great day. Bye.